Good morning and welcome to Chem Advisor's presentation on using the LOLI data to aid in GHS classification. I'm Janet Neal and I'll be serving as the meeting's moderator. We should have time at the end of the meeting to have questions, so please do use the question option area in the GoToMeeting toolbar. Today our presenter is Jennifer Mahoney, team leader for the consulting group. And we'll start the presentation now. Jennifer?
Thank you, Janet. For today's topic, using LOLI data to aid in GHS classification, we are going to talk just a tiny bit about GHS and really look at how the LOLI regulatory database that Chem Advisor compiles and makes available, how that information can be used to research and gather data in order to be able to complete a classification for a substance. We're going to focus on substance level data. The LOLI database does not contain mixture level data, but once our substances are classified, we can then proceed on completing our mixture classifications for GHS compliance. Briefly on the GHS, GHS is the globally harmonized system of classification and labeling. It provides a framework for communicating hazards that could be used around the world as individual countries take that framework and then build it into their own rulemaking process to set standards and requirements for the classification, labeling, and then there could be training aspects as well for a complete HAZCOM program. Under the GHS, there are testing that is required or recommended for gathering data that would be scientifically sound as well as valid according to international procedures and criteria. For physical hazards, again, there are test methods related to flammability, explosivity, corrosivity, and so on. Animal data as well as human experience data can also be used for support of health endpoints, and then ecotoxicity testing and species identified for the environmental endpoints as well. Where we don't have data on a specific substance, there are published classifications that countries have compiled, and those published classifications can be used to determine acute toxicity point estimates according to the GHS to support the evaluation of a mixture and to calculate any given endpoints. All information available should kind of be taken into consideration for GHS classification. We will talk a little bit about country-specific requirements in a little bit here. The GHS itself is not intended to harmonize risk management decisions or assessment procedures. Some countries have separate risk assessment guidelines. For risk assessment with the GHS, the hazards are taken into consideration, and then the exposure associated with the material to then evaluate the overall risk. So for some countries, there are some big changes in just the thought process for how an assessment and a resulting classification is identified. There are different threshold levels now, and for the United States, where we typically had a 0.1 and 1% threshold for our hazard-based system, as we move into GHS, there's the risk factor that comes into play as well. So there's judgment, in addition to just gathering our data, there's judgment that needs to kind of be overlaid with all of the data that we've compiled. And then the GHS aims to minimize the minimizing the hazard of the exposure then minimizes the risk, and hazard communication tools, the SDS and the label and then associated training would alert the user to the hazards, but also through GHS, the symbols that are used, the signal words and phrasing that's used, help all users to have just a consistent way to identify the hazards on the label or on the SDS, and then be able to take appropriate measures to minimize their individual exposure. So our agenda today includes reviewing the LOLI regulatory database content to show where the physical property data is available and what data the database contains, toxicity data, ecotoxicity data, and those are the things that are most straightforward. But there are other lists within LOLI that contain relevant information that can also be helpful. Also, the LOLI database contains published GHS classifications. Once we review the data, we will walk through an example to identify how that data kind of comes together and can be used to support determining a GHS classification. The current content in the LOLI regulatory database includes physical chemical property data to address physical hazards and identify physical hazards, acute toxicity data. For the ecotox data, we have aquatic and terrestrial organism endpoints. Also advisory agencies such as ACGIH, NFPA, NIOSH, NTP, IARC, and others contain information that would support the overall classification and should also be taken into consideration. Country-specific data, as mentioned, and then unique to the LOLI regulatory database is what we call a standardized view of those GHS country-specific classifications. And I'll talk a little bit more about the standardized view, where we've kind of taken the different formats that GHS classifications have been published in by different competent authorities and streamlined them into a consistent format, and we've broken them apart in a consistent way to make it easier on the eyeballs as well as easier on a programmer trying to write rules and pull information out to develop tools to aid the GHS classification process. And then also inventory lists and transportation data can also be referenced for completing a classification. And this is all of the data types that the LOLI regulatory database contains. To talk first about the physical property data, we have 30 separate physical property lists in LOLI. And on the next 4 slides or so, we've identified the LOLI lists, and for individuals with direct access to LOLI, if it's helpful, we've identified the list ID, which is just the number of the list assigned to each one, the name of the list, and then as of October 2011, which was the close of our previous quarter, the number of records on that list, and an applicability column to show physical property data doesn't just support classification for physical hazard endpoints. They can also be used in determining health and environmental endpoints when we start to take into consideration that risk factor as well as the hazards. So we have SMILES notations, which can be used to support modeling efforts using other applications or platforms, molecular weight to support our conversions and other calculations, and then water solubilities, vapor pressures, vapor densities, pH values, autoignition temperatures, and evaporation rates, coefficient of octanol water distribution, appearance, boiling point, density, extinguishing media for fire, melting points, flash points, Henry's law constants, specific gravity, water solubilities, qualitative values, water miscibilities, odors, extinguishing media for fires, again with unsuitable materials, bulk densities, odor threshold values, and then detection limits for odor thresholds, heats of combustion, heats of formation, states of matter, colors, bioconcentration factors. And finally, on this slide, we see the INCI notations that stands for the International Chemical Identifier, which can be useful in modeling and identifying functional groups for a specific substance. Physical property data is useful for populating sections of the SCS when you have a pure material and helping to aid in the evaluation process for, again, all endpoints, health, physical, and environmental. Toxicity data, we have a wide variety of data from sources that have been reviewed, peer-reviewed, and validated. Published toxicity data can vary widely in the quality of the data and consistency and reproducibility of the endpoints. And inconsistent classifications based on a specific toxicity value used can lead to eventual overclassification or underclassification. There is one list right now in LOLI that contains oral, dermal, and inhalation endpoints. That's the toxicology data, selected LD50 and LC50 lists. And where there is publicly available experimental data, then it can be included in this list. Selecting the most appropriate value takes judgment, because often we see information available in different animal species, and depending on the material, that value may not always extrapolate well to human applications. Some example records for how that data shows up. We have inhalation values that always show up first when present, and then oral data will populate next, and then dermal data. So you can see we have the route of exposure, the species, the value, and the units, and this is a semicolon delimited list. So here are a couple examples for how that data shows up. For more information on LOLI and the toxicity data contained in LOLI, there is a presentation available, most recently updated in December 2011, that goes through understanding ChemAdvisor's approach to toxicity data and ecotoxicity data in the LOLI database. I'm glad to address questions, but please refer to that information as well. Ecotoxicity data, we have aquatic endpoints, which include freshwater fish, invertebrate, and algal endpoints, terrestrial data on avians, birds, earthworms, and honeybees. And on this slide, we have, again, the LOLI list ID, the name of the list, and for our ecotoxicity data, the lists are divided by species, by organism, and then species are identified in the far right column. Again, for both the tox and ecotox slides here, we have the total number of records as of October 2011. These lists are always growing as we continue to evaluate data. Again, this is publicly available data. We do not include manufacturer or vendor-specific data that is not available in a public forum. So here we have the earthworm data and honeybees. Other relevant lists beyond the specific tox data or ecotox data endpoints can include things like the ACGIH list for biological exposure indices, sensitization and skin notation lists, IARC list for carcinogenicity classifications, the UN Environmental Program list that shows the Montreal Protocol, ozone depleters, and how those are grouped. And finally, the OECD SIDS chemicals. And here we have, just a list that shows whether or not a chemical is present. And then you can utilize the links available through LOLI to go to the source for all of these. You can go to the source and pull up the specific information available for each chemical. These are just a couple of the examples. There certainly are more. And there are country-specific versions of some of these lists as well for the occupational exposure limits, skin notation, sensitizers, et cetera. That additional information may not be kind of primary in your thought process for doing a GHS classification. We're looking for tox data or we're looking for ecotox data. But there are also for other endpoints, we have endocrine disruptor lists where it's not necessarily a classified endpoint specifically under the GHS framework, but one of those other hazards that should be classified or addressed during a evaluation and then subsequent SDS or label preparation. Published GHS classifications are also available in LOLI, and we currently have GHS classification lists for Australia, the European Union, Indonesia, Japan, New Zealand, South Africa, South Korea, and Taiwan. There are also GHS style classifications available from, for example, the EFFA and WHO, and those lists are also available in LOLI. I mentioned that I was going to come back and talk a little bit more about the standardized view concept. The GHS standardized view lists have been compiled using a combination of the source information for the classification itself and then layering that against the GHS Purple Book, which is currently on revision 4, and using the source information, harmonizing the view, the resulting view of the information for each individual classification. When a source note, a source entry is incomplete, we've made decisions to fill in the gaps. And when I say incomplete, I mean that the source publishes only the H code, for example. Well, then we'll take that H code and go back and identify the classification category, the hazard class and the category that goes along with that, and present a common set of fields for, again, the user's eye to be able to pick out readily the data that they need and not have to go back to a source to see what's H319 again. We'll include the hazard code right in the list. This approach, again, will hopefully maximize the utility of that data of each of these individual lists for not only the eyeballs, but for programming as well. Rules that, again, help to support tools to help the classification process go more smoothly and to aid consistency in GHS classifications. The information in these lists, I have to say, is compiled as part of a good faith effort to provide harmonized classification details in a uniform manner across all country-specific implementations of GHS. If there is an error in the source list, we tried to go back to the competent authority to identify what should the actual classification and associated endpoints be. And sometimes we're not able to do that. But we've kind of taken the best approach and really gone through these lists to first and foremost make it useful information to myself and to our team of hazard communication experts, and then to share this information with our customers as well. The standardized view lists include CAS numbers, chemical names, any approval numbers or other identifiers that are published by the competent authorities, for example, the approval numbers for New Zealand. LOLI itself also has find CAS features to support querying the database, starting from a KE and ENCS, INEX, annex number, chemical name, even UN number, and you can see all the chemicals that are associated with an individual UN number, and then proceed with a broad database query from there. The data field on these lists include the hazard classification, the route of exposure, if appropriate, the hazard category, and the hazard statement, which includes the hazard code. And that's the majority of the list. We also have a single labeling list for each of the each country, and the labeling list will also include the precautionary phrases as well. All GHS SV lists, the standardized view lists, have the same format no matter what the country, no matter what the source. So again, we've kind of standardized this. An example here that we're looking at now is from Japan. And from this query, being a Japan source list, the chemical name is in Japanese, but everything else is in English. And you can see that we have an individual list for each hazard class. So they're alphabetically ordered, and we start with the acute hazards for the aquatic environment, acute toxicity, dermal, inhalation, oral, carcinogenicity, and so on and so forth. And if we take a quick look at carcinogenicity, what we're looking at right now is the Japan source list. So we have, for the carcinogenicity endpoint, category 1A, the symbol is the health hazard symbol, signal word is danger, and the statement is may cause cancer. And that's how the source published this information. Looking at all of the different source lists for the carcinogen endpoint, for Australia, they publish the category, the symbol, the signal word, and the statement. And for Australia, they include by inhalation as the route of exposure. EU published everything in code. We have CARC category 2. The hazard statement is H351. And then EU has the notes that apply for this endpoint. In this case, it's notes B and D. Indonesia has a single list that includes all of the endpoints together. And I kind of tried to highlight the relevant portion. It's kind of buried there in the middle of that paragraph. May cause cancer, especially respiratory channel. Overall, the symbol for this query is corrosion, health hazard, skull and crossbones, signal word of danger, and then Indonesia went through and listed the hazard statements only. Japan, we just looked at. Korea, we have the endpoint for the category, carcinogen category 1. Symbol is health hazard, signal word is danger. The hazard statement is H350, but there's no statement itself, just the code. And then the precautionary statements for prevention, response, storage, and disposal, we have the codes only from the Korean source. For New Zealand has a unique set of codes that correspond with each hazard class and category. The relevant items here are 6.7 is the carcinogen endpoint for New Zealand. New Zealand also has some threshold limits that apply when a substance is present. This particular substance is present in a mixture. So you see the first entry on the first line there applies for the substance when present at 0.25 to less than 1% in a mixture, and then carcinogenicity kicks in above 1%. From 1 to 5%, you see the first occurrence of the 6.7A, And then finally, for greater than 5 to 25%, another set of classifications. And then finally for Taiwan, again, they have kind of buried in here the may cause cancer, and I missed highlighting the hazard class as well in the second line here, carcinogenicity, category 1. So all of their categories are listed together, and then the hazard statements, again, without the code. So you can see kind of a comparison just for this single endpoint, the different types of presentations that the source lists offer. Looking at the standardized view, we have now taken that information from those different source lists and streamlined the way that we present this information. So every single country now has a carcinogenicity list only, as well as every other class that is included in the country-specific classification. So we present the class, if published, the route of exposure, the category, the hazard code, and then the hazard statement. In the case of the European Union, the abbreviations that are to be used in the SDS are included, so CARC-CAT2 in that case, and then you can see the notices that apply as well. And for New Zealand, we included the specific concentration limits that apply for that listing. But everything is set up the same way, streamlined. It's very easy for the eyes to see, in this case, where the differences are. We have materials that are classified as Category 1, 1A, 1B, and 2. The standardized view list name syntax would include the country name, so Japan, Australia, whatever, and then GHS SV, so you want to look for that SV in the list name for the standardized view, and then the hazard class, in this case, carcinogenicity. So for an example, looking at the GHS, the scope of data for GHS classifications, the query used for this example is for carbon tetrachloride, and the CAS number is 56235. And we're using LOLI Online as the platform for gathering our information. So we're looking at the LOLI query screen from LOLI Online. And the results that we have will show up. You have a couple different options. I'm showing a tree view right now, and I can expand each of those headers to see the specific lists available for the number, the CAS material that I have queried. So looking first at the GHS standardized view, we have country-specific classifications for the European Union, Japan, Korea, New Zealand, and Taiwan. And we have, under the non-regulatory information header, the ecotox health and physical endpoint list. And there's also information available under the advisory list, under some of the other European-specific lists or U.S.-specific lists, transport, et cetera, that can also be expanded to review for each query. Looking at the standardized view for GHS, one thing I did not mention yet was the composite list. This would be the classification of the material. It doesn't include the precautionary statements. That's the labeling list. You can see examples for the carbon tetrachloride query for the EU here. So that first list shows just the composite list where we have all of the different hazard classes that are addressed by the EU competent authority. And those are listed sequentially, one right after the other. And then the labeling view presents overall the hazards, not the classification, just the hazards with the hazard code, the hazard statements, and then the precautionary statements that correspond. The precautionary statements identified are GHS Purple Book precautionary statements, not EU-specific precautionary statements. So depending on the use of the material, the size of your package, then judgment would need to be applied to trim these down to the 6 that are recommended by the European Union. So again, these standardized view lists relate back to the current version of the Purple Book. In this case, we're now in revision 4, using the classifications themselves published by each competent authority. Looking at the non-regulatory information, here we can see the ecotox data, the health endpoints for inhalation, oral, and dermal exposure, and then the physical properties, just showing a few of the relevant lists. I think there were about 16 or 18 hits for carbon tetrachloride on the various lists that LOLI contains. And then finally, just looking quickly at the transport query, that does look a little bit different than the standard LOLI query, but you can scroll through each of those tabs to see the different modes and be able to identify the transport classification as well. In this case, the material is classified as 6.1 for the hazard class, which is the toxic hazmat classification. And so we would want to kind of just keep that in the back of our mind as we're working on our overall classification, that we should end up toxic somewhere along the way. So determining a GHS classification using the data, we've done the query. So now for actually doing the classification, just highlights here we need to use for the GHS classification, use published as well as your internal data. So as a manufacturer or as a service provider, if you have customers with data, you have vendors with data upstream from your process, or if you are manufacturing and testing materials yourselves, it's that information that needs to come into play as well. And the LOLI database does not contain that scope of information. Where you have test data, that should be prioritized over any of the publicly available data. So for physical properties, tox, and ecotox. When it comes to actually classifying for a specific country, if your data does not support, if, for example, a chemical is specifically published with a classification in the EU, for example, then there's been a process to go through to submit your data and request kind of a change to the published classification with your justification. And those requirements vary from country to country. Acute toxicity point estimates, when we need to do a mixture classification, sometimes we have information on substances that really just consist of the published classification or the classification that our vendor has provided. We don't have the data point that could back up that classification. So if we query a chemical and there are no tox or ecotox endpoints, then we have some additional work to do for the toxicity values to convert them to acute toxicity point estimates that we can then utilize in additivity formulas. So for the standardized view list, you would see something like acute toxicity oral category 3, H301, toxic if swallowed. And then table 3.1.2 of the Purple Book, again, remember we're going back to GHS current version, which is revision 4. Table 3.1.2 gives the converted acute toxicity point estimate to use in the formulation for classifying mixtures. And given H301, oral category 3, that would equate a 100 milligram per kilogram ATE for this chemical. Some countries have data points, but because of copyright issues, ChemAdvisor received permission to include the list but not include the data. And so in those cases, the word present will appear when we do the query. So for example, South Africa has GHS classifications, but we're not able to present the classification itself. The source list will simply show present, and there's no corresponding standardized view list for South Africa. From LOLI, there is then a link back to the source, and you can request information or request access to those published classifications. So once we have our data, the first thing is to gather all the available data, which includes the specific data endpoints as well as published classifications, as well as that other relevant data that I mentioned, looking at the skin notations, the ozone depleters, the endocrine disruptor lists, and our physical hazards, not just for physical hazard endpoints, but also to support the classification for health and or environmental toxicity as well. And kind of take a combination approach with the publicly available data as well as your vendor information to arrive at the classification. So, for example, going back to carbon tetrachloride, here is the physical property endpoints that are available. And for the physical hazard classes, we're looking for flammability, we're looking for corrosive to metal. We don't see anything in here that specifically supports a physical endpoint, but we do see evaporation rates, we see melting points, the vapor density and vapor pressure, water solubility, and those endpoints can help us to classify for the health and environmental endpoints. Toxicity data, we have an inhalation of 800 ppm for over 4 hours, oral 2350 milligrams per kilogram, and the dermal LD50 5070 milligrams per kilogram. These are the publicly available sources. Ecotoxicity data, varying from the species. The values are there at the top of the screen. Again, as I mentioned, there are physical property lists that will support ecotoxicity classification, and so a few of those are highlighted at the bottom half of the screen. The GHS standardized view lists, here we have the European Union, and for the next several slides is for the country-specific views. I've shown the endpoint-specific lists first. So you see here acute toxicity dermal, inhalation, oral, and then carcinogenicity, and then chronic aquatic, hazardous to the ozone layer, and specific target organ toxicity for repeated exposure. And then, as I mentioned, we have a composite view for each country. And that composite view shows the class, the route of exposure, the H code, and the H statement, hazard statement. And then just to quickly, kind of provide another view to make it a little bit easier to digest as I go through these slides quicker than you could probably read all those details, the resulting classifications by category. So we have, that bottom screenshot just with a summary. So that's for the European Union. For Japan, same thing. We have another extra endpoint or two classified by Japan, and we see the composite view as well as the summary view. Korea, and these classifications obviously differ. Not every country is classifying for the same scope of endpoints, and when they are classified, as we saw for the carcinogenicity example earlier, countries vary across the board from Category 1 in that case all the way through Category 2. And so we looked at New Zealand, here's Taiwan. A combination approach looking at the data as well as the published classifications might result in a carbon tetrachloride classification of acute toxicity oral Category 5, acute toxicity inhalation Category 4, skin corrosion irritation Category 2, eye damage and irritation Category 2A, carcinogenicity Category 2, specific target organ toxicity, repeat exposure Category 1, hazardous to the aquatic environment acute Category 3, hazardous to the environment chronic category 3 and hazardous to the ozone layer category 1. And this classification approach prioritizes the data. Where we have tox data, we have ecotox data, those data points have been prioritized over any published classification. Now, this specific classification does not align with the EU published classification. So if I'm going into Europe, I have different data, I would need to follow the European guidelines for notifying. If I'm doing a GHS classification for a country that doesn't have published classifications, well, I might want to use judgment and streamline and go with a different country-specific classification, but I would then certainly need to make sure that the data throughout my SDS supports that specific classification. Those are some of the different approaches that our customers have taken. This is the overall an example of how we can arrive at the overall classification for carbon tetrachloride. As mentioned, it doesn't match, for example, the EU. It doesn't match any of the country-specific published classifications. And as mentioned, they don't match one another. The next several slides go through each of those endpoints and the different data values that are available. So for oral toxicity, from the data, we get to category 5, oral LD50 of 2350 per table 3.1.2 in revision 4 of the Purple Book. That would be a category 5 classification. The EU, Korea, and New Zealand classify carbon tetrachloride as category 3. Japan, Taiwan, Australia don't classify an acute tox oral endpoint for carbon tet. And then so on and so forth for each of these hazard classes. These slides summarize all of the different data that we saw on the previous slides by endpoint. And as you can see, country to country, the consistency varies. So we have a couple countries with single exposure endpoint for specific target organ toxicity. For example, Japan. In my evaluation process, if Japan is the only country that has classified for that endpoint, I would want to look for additional information and may or may not include that endpoint in my overall classification. But the judgment process is going to differ from HAZCOM specialist to HAZCOM specialist. So training is important, consistency in approach is important, and being able to pull out data and prioritize data for inclusion is important as well. LOLI data is limited. There are data gaps where if you have vendor data, you have company-specific data as a manufacturer, and you have tested your materials, that information is not going to be in LOLI. LOLI is a good reference, but it also is a starting point. There are endpoints where there may be questions and you need to go back to the original source or look for confirmation in order to ultimately arrive at the GHS classification. But this is a summary of how LOLI as a tool can support that process. Future plans for LOLI, we have additional country-specific GHS classifications to include. We have Malaysia already. The standardized view will be coming in the first quarter of 2012. And then other countries that have announced plans to publish classifications include China and Thailand. Those are not available quite yet. Other relevant sources already in LOLI with GHS style classifications include the EFFA and WHO. Those will also be migrating to a standardized view, but the source list itself is already available. And that's everything that I have as part of the presentation.